Hi, I'm Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground. Welcome to this week's episode of The Underground, a program that explores the testimony of the biblical prophets, the gospel of Jesus Christ, current events, and how all of these things relate to you and me. Now, in this week's episode, I want to jump back in to continue the discussion of the great harlot, often referred to as Mystery Babylon. This is the longest prophecy in the whole New Testament. It actually encompasses all of Revelation chapter 17, 18, and then it rolls a bit into Revelation 19. As I said, this is the longest oracle, the longest prophecy in the New Testament, which comprises a couple of the final chapters, not only of the book of Revelation, but of the whole Bible. And it's a topic which it's easy for a lot of people to look at this as being a little bit of a strange subject. You know, this is not a topic that is commonly taught or preached upon in most churches. I think even most pastors, they would look at this and go, this is a difficult, kind of strange topic. But the fact of the matter is that we are dealing with a prophecy which will have profound implications, profound ramifications for those who live on the earth in the last days. And because I believe that we are very rapidly approaching that period that the Bible refers to as the last days, I think it's essential that Christians gather together around this prophecy, discuss it together, and try to understand what the Scriptures are saying. What does it mean to us? And so, of course, as I mentioned last week, I have just released my newest book, Mystery Babylon, Unlocking the Bible's Greatest Prophetic Mystery. It's a book that I've been working on for a little bit over 10 or 11 years. Haven't been working on it the whole time, but I actually started this about 11 years ago, and I finally just finished it this year. So Mystery Babylon, very excited to finally get this out there. This was a book which every time I would work on it a bit, I kept feeling as though the Lord was telling me to set it aside for the time being. And it was not until last year, 2016, that I finally felt the release of the Holy Spirit to go ahead and finish the book and get it out there. And I believe the information in here is profoundly relevant with regard to events that are unfolding in the earth today. Now, also what I've done, because I always try to bundle resources together to try to give my listeners discounts, what I've done is I've put this book together. Now, of course, you can just get this on my website if you just want to get the book. And of course, you get it, I'll sign it and so forth. But what I've also done is I've bundled it together not only with the book, but also with the Antichrist debate. Do the Scriptures teach a Roman or a Muslim Antichrist? That's Dr. Thomas Ice took the position that the Antichrist would be Roman or European. Of course, I took the position that he would be Muslim out of the Middle East. This is 2 hours, 45 minutes. And then finally, another book which a lot of people have never heard of, but I found it to be one of the most important books in modern times that I'm convinced that anyone who studies and is interested in biblical prophecy needs to read this book. So it's called Babylon Reconsidered by the Reverend Ralph Woodrow. I'm going to talk a bit more about this sometime, but it's really a profound book. And I mean, I'll just summarize it. But the Reverend Woodrow, he actually wrote a book, became very well known. The book was very successful. It was actually sort of his revision of a much older book that had been written in the late 1800s by the Reverend Alexander Hislop, a Scottish minister. And Ralph Woodrow sort of became the modern reincarnation, if you will, of Hislop. I mean, not literally. But he was traveling, speaking all over the world, teaching on these things. And then he actually became convinced that the information in his book was not accurate. And he did what very, very few teachers have the integrity to do, is he actually wrote a book and renounced his previous writings and explained why he believed it was wrong and really apologized and said, I was wrong and here's why. Again, not an easy thing to do for so many different reasons, but this is just, it's such an incredible book, and it is a perfect complement to my book, Mystery Babylon. So I put these together in what I'm calling the Babylon Bundle. So if you go to my website at Joel's Trumpet, you can get all those together and save some money in the process. So this issue, Mystery Babylon. Now, to be technically accurate, and I think this is really worth mentioning, is that most commentators, even though this is the name of my book, the title of my book, Mystery Babylon, most commentators don't believe that Mystery Babylon is a title. What they actually believe is it says, come, I'm going to tell you a mystery, and then sort of semicolon, Babylon the Great. So the title of this harlot, the name that is given to this harlot is Babylon the Great, the mother of all harlots, the mother of harlots, not all harlots, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. And of course, in verse 1, it refers to this entity as the great harlot. So really, any of these terms we could use sort of interchangeably. And essentially what you have is really something just very bizarre. I mean, admittedly bizarre, grotesque. You have a woman who is a prostitute. Some translations just call her the great whore. This is probably an important point. I make this in the book, and I think this is a very important point to make in modern times. Today we have more slaves in the earth than at any time in human history. Now, probably the overwhelming majority of these slaves are working in the sex industry, so to speak. And the vast majority of them don't want to be doing what they're doing. Some of them were children that were literally sold by their parents at a young age to others to be used for their own gratification. Others were, runaways or on the streets, or sometimes even just straight up kidnapped, trafficked, and again, forced into prostitution. So when we use this term, the great whore, that's not who we're talking about. That's not what the Revelation is talking about. Revelation is talking about a vile, grotesque woman who has given herself over to this spirit, this lifestyle of whoredom, of prostitution, of harlotry. So she's the great harlot, but she's not just a prostitute, she's also a queen. And she is a brazen, vile woman. I mean, just to mix the combination of these things, a queen and a prostitute all at once. And then, of course, the Bible, which is often, admittedly, very graphic. It describes her as holding a gold cup in her hand, which is filled with the filth of her fornication, the filth of her prostitution, if you will. I mean, this is a stomach-churning, disgusting woman, and everything about the picture of her is disgusting. But it not only is it filled with the filth of her prostitution, it's mixed with the blood of the saints and of the witnesses of Jesus. And then to make matters worse, she's drunk on this foul mixture, and she's getting the peoples and the kings of the earth drunk on this as well. So this is very strange symbolism. Now, what is typical whenever we have an apocalyptic passage in the Bible that's filled with symbolism, difficult to understand, an angel comes along and explains the symbolism. And so that's exactly what we have here in Revelation. Then we have an angel that comes along, and he explains that this woman, she's not a literal woman. She's actually a city. She is an entity. She is a geopolitical reality. She is a city that we can identify in the earth. And of course, it's worth mentioning as well that beyond being merely a city, she is a geopolitical entity. So in the same way that in ancient times you could refer to Rome, Rome is the city, yes, but it also in many ways refers to the larger empire of Rome. Today, it's not much different. By referring to Washington, we are actually referring to the United States. We could say Washington is in conflict with Moscow. Well, we're talking about the United States and Russia. And so in the same way that these terms are used to refer to the greater whole, in ancient times, it's really no different. So it is a city, but it's not restricted purely just to a city. We have sort of a city-state, if you will, a megalopolis, a megapolis, a mega city. But this entity is repeatedly, overwhelmingly defined as a religiously corrupting system of idolatry, a false religious system, and also an economically corrupting system. So there's the combination of religious and financial corruption that this woman is involved in really just ensnaring the inhabitants of the world and pulling people into her idolatrous system. So 8 times throughout Revelation 17 all the way till 19, it refers to her as a city. Now, it's important to take note that this description of her as a city, this is not allegorical. The portion of the text that is allegory is the woman, the grotesque woman. Some interpreters that I've read, they sort of view it as a metaphor, is probably more accurate, is a metaphor within a metaphor. You know, the woman is a metaphor, and then the city is a metaphor, and then they interpret it as something that is neither a woman nor a city. It's really just a conceptual thing. The scriptures, I think, are pretty clear that the descriptions of the woman, that's the metaphor, that's the symbolism. The interpretation of the city, that's literal. The angel speaks of it literally. When this city is destroyed, you can see the smoke of its destruction going up from the sea. It actually lists many of her imports, and it describes her in ways that really can only be, a literal city can only be described this way. So that's important. Now, here's something that I have found in writing this and in discussing this, is that this is a subject which stirs up some of the most profound disagreements and really just dogmatic opinions, which is really funny because this is a prophecy which is admittedly very difficult, very mysterious. And I found in writing the book, the more that you dig into this stuff, the more that you really sort of plunge the depths of Christian interpretation down through history, the more that you realize that it is very difficult. But I've had many people that have just, emailed me or, posted comments on my site or tried to. I don't post comments on my site if they're just, contentious, but just, Joel, this is that clearly, or this is that. And, these are 4 different opinions that people are offering, and they're all just absolutely confident that they understand the solution to this mystery. So what I want to do for the remainder of this brief program is just take some time to survey the various opinions that are out there. And so the first chapter that I have in the book is called The History of the Mystery. And this is where I do just that. I just work through what have the Christians believed down through history, what have been the primary interpretations. And so the first view of this particular prophecy by the early church was that it was referring to the ancient pagan city of Rome. Now, this was a view that was written and discussed by, we've got Lactantius, Tertullian, Irenaeus, and Jerome. So these are some of the most prominent early church writers, all the way up until Jerome wrote in the 4th and 5th century, which is, the 600s. Up into the 600s, the church, throughout this period, believed that it was pagan Rome that was the fulfillment of Mystery Babylon. Of course, it's always important to take note of the fact that the early church lived under the shadow. They lived under the dominance of pagan Rome. And so it was quite natural that when they read the Bible, that they assumed, well, clearly this must refer to that which we live under, because they, just like everyone, thought that the Bible was primarily contextually speaking to them in their particular time and circumstances, etc. But it was, it was during this period that, of course, as we know, that the Roman Empire essentially converted to Christianity. And so pagan Rome, in many ways, collapsed. Now, we may say, well, this was sort of a corrupted form of Christianity, etc., etc. Certainly that's true, but the point is that by and large, the pagan Rome of ancient times and the pagan Rome after its coming to Christianity was drastically different. Now Christians held power. Now the Roman emperors claimed to confess Christianity and so forth, and Christians actually were in high positions of government power. So it was a very different scenario, if you will. So by the 6th century, by the 700s, we have the writings of Andrew of Caesarea. And this is the first time in any of the early church writings that we have references where Andrew specifically said, he said, look, all of the fathers, the earlier Christian writers, they believed that the harlot Babylon was Rome, was pagan Rome. He says, but pagan Rome has lost its power. So by the 6th century, the pagan empire was collapsing. Andrew took note of that, and he said, I now question this interpretation. He says, I don't think it's ever going to regain the political power that it once had. The ancient, great pagan Roman Empire had essentially begun its dramatic collapse. And so he expressed that he believed that Mystery Babylon, or the Great Harlot Babylon, was actually some end-time entity that really wasn't in existence during his time. And so I would agree with him, of course. And this position, this view, this sort of nebulous position, this was the position held by the church then for the next few hundred years. There was no real clarity on the passage. It was sort of like, well, I guess we'll know it when we see it. And so it was not until the 1200s and 1300s that another fellow came along. We find in his writings, his name is Nicholas of Lyra, and he wrote a commentary on the Apocalypse, and it's in Lyra's book that he actually, for the first time, now of course, Andrew was writing in the 6th century, and this was the century that Islam began, and very quickly thereafter, Islam sort of burst forth throughout the Middle East, and it ripped the heart out of the ancient Christian church. So all of the great missionary sending capitals of Ephesus, Antioch, Alexandria, the 7 churches of Revelation, Jerusalem, of course, these were very quickly conquered by the Islamic hordes. And so it was during this time that many Christians began sort of looking to Islam as the system of the Antichrist. We have numerous references to this in the writings of St. John of Damascus, and a handful of other early church writers, Eastern writers. We find the idea as they were sort of wrestling through, could this be the system of the Antichrist? Well, it was Nicholas who, again, in the 14th century, so in the 1300s, he actually made it very clear. He referred to them as the Saracens or the Turks. These were the terms that were used generically to refer to Muslims, and he referred to that as the Great Harlot, as Harlot Babylon. And so this is the first time that there was sort of, after the fall of pagan Rome, that there was suddenly this new view on Mystery Babylon, and that was the primary interpretation among Christians. Nicholas had incredible influence, by the way. He was a brilliant Franciscan Hebrew scholar. His works were really referenced heavily by many of the reformers that would come a couple hundred years after him. But this was the position that seems to have, at least for a couple hundred years, dominated the view of the medieval church. Well, of course, then we had the Reformation. And as we all know, you had, Protestants and Catholics at each other's throats. The Catholics, of course, were far more politically in power at the time, so far more Protestants were dying and being killed and being martyred and so forth. But it was during this time that Martin Luther's friend, Lucas Cranach, he actually created these woodcuts that would then be used in Martin Luther's Bible. And it actually we've seen a lot of these pictures. They're still very popular today. But it has a picture of the Pope riding the 7-headed dragon, riding the 7-headed beast. And this was because the Protestants began looking again at Rome, except no longer at pagan Rome, but rather at the papal or the popish Rome, at the Vatican, so to speak. And so the Protestants, really, for the next few hundred years, this dominated the reformers' perspective and those that followed them. The Protestants, by and large, were now again looking back to the city of Rome, the Vatican, the Catholic Church as the Great Harlot. And then, of course, in the 1800s, there's been all sorts of different folks that have really sort of breathed new life into or expanded upon this view. But this is Alexander Hislop. I mentioned him at the beginning, the Scottish minister who wrote the book, The Two Babylons. And I'd say very few people added or contributed to this discussion of the Roman Catholic Church, the Vatican, as Mystery Babylon, as Hislop. Now, as I state in my book, as I argue in my book, Mystery Babylon, Alexander Hislop wrote one of the greatest theological frauds in all of church history. And that's a strong statement to make, but I actually argue that Alexander Hislop likely had some sort of mental illness, that he probably was suffering from some type of autism spectrum, or he was actually schizophrenic. And, I'm not in any way picking on anyone with any type of, genetic disorder, or, their brain's just not quite wired right, or if they had some kind of mental illness. But the patterns of thought that he displays in this book fall classically into that category of delusion, of seeing all kinds of connections and signs where none exists, and patterns and this sort of thing. And so, nevertheless, many, many people look to this book as sort of this great work of scholarship, but it's really one of the greatest, as I said, theological frauds of modern times, and it has had a deep impact on sort of the thought process of many Protestants, particularly those that study biblical prophecy, even in our time. A couple decades ago, we had Dave Hunt wrote the book, A Woman Rides the Beast. Again, this breathed profound fresh air into the idea the Vatican is the great harlot. I know I was talking with Bill Salas recently. That's the position that he holds. And of course, there are still many that sort of hold that view. I find that many prophecy teachers today, they actually hold a combination of a few views. It's as though they're sort of hold that it's the Catholic Church, but it's also the Illuminati, it's also the UN, and it's sort of a combination of all these things. You've got others that sort of just say, in a more general sense, it's ecumenism or apostate Christianity. Again, it's difficult to point to what is the city that is the headquarters of apostate Christianity, this sort of thing. Again, that's much more conceptual, and that's where you have folks that most often try to interpret Revelation as not just a metaphor with regard to the woman, but also the city. It's a metaphor within a metaphor, this sort of thing. Another view, which is very, very popular today, is here's a book called The Final Babylon. I'm really friendly with Doug Woodward. He's one of the co-authors of this book. He argues that the United States is Mystery Babylon, or that New York City or Wall Street, or even, again, a combination, the UN, which is there in New York City, or a combination of all these things. Hollywood's great influence on the world, its corrupting influence. So a lot of Christians have really bought into that. In fact, one book that has had a huge impact is a book called The End of America by John Price. This book, he actually argues that the Antichrist system is Islam, but that the system of Babylon is the United States. And for those that don't know, by the way, John Price actually, I believe he was in his late 70s. He just passed away just a few weeks ago. He was living down there in Costa Rica, because he got out of the United States, because he believed it was Mystery Babylon. And this is one of the reasons why this information has profound pastoral implications. If we get it wrong, the prophecy says, get out of Mystery Babylon if you're a follower. Another view that is, as I mentioned, also quite popular, the Babylon Code. This book argues that it's the Illuminati, that it's secret societies that go back to Nimrod and this sort of thing. And my discussion, again, of Alexander Hislop and the Nimrod traditions, I have 2 chapters where I deal with that. It has pretty big, profound relevance to this issue. Did Nimrod have secret societies? Did he start a religion and all of these things? Those ideas are accepted as fact, but in fact, there's really no solid history to testify to that. These things all come from extra biblical traditions that are not found in the scriptures. Many of them are demonstrably false traditions, and many of them contradictory traditions. So again, another reason why some of the information in my book is so critical for students of prophecy to understand. Then there is the idea that Mystery Babylon is Jerusalem. Now, this position is really going to be broken up into 2 different camps. Some are preterists. They believe that biblical prophecy was all fulfilled in the past, and they say that when Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, that was the fulfillment of Revelation. Amazingly, and really quite sadly, N.T. Wright, who is considered by some to be one of the world's leading New Testament scholars of our times, he actually embraces that view. I mean, it's such a destructive, a destructive position to look at the events of 70 A.D. As sort of the culmination of the expectation and longing of the prophets, to look at what is often viewed as the second Holocaust and say this is the fulfillment of Jewish hope. And it really is a perversion. Similarly, Joel McDurmon, who is the president of American Vision, he succeeded Gary DeMar. He takes that position, repeatedly refers to Israel as that great whore, that great prostitute, and we're the new church, we're the pristine bride, and all of these sort of things. He speaks of that in his book called Jesus Verse Jerusalem. Another guy, Don Preston, he is a hyper-preterist, so he actually believes that we're already in the New Jerusalem. We've already spiritually been raised from the dead, resurrected from the dead, and all of these sort of things. Needless to say, if that's the case, then the New Jerusalem stinks, right? We can all agree on that. But then the other camp are those who believe that Jerusalem will fulfill the prophecy of Babylon in the days ahead. And really, the only book that I know of where someone argues that is this book by Chris White called Mystery Babylon. Real thin book, but he argues that. And, again, this is a position which just has so many incontrovertible problems, some insurmountable barriers to it working with other texts. And so, again, I have a whole chapter where I deal with that in my book. And then finally, there is the position which is very popular, and this is the position which, for me, is my second most likely position. To me, it's sort of like, gets the silver award, is that Mystery Babylon is simply literal Babylon. That in the days ahead, the city of Babylon, right there on the ruins of the ancient Babylon, will be rebuilt. Numerous books out there that espouse this. You've got the Shinar Directive by Michael Lake. A lot of the prophetic writers from the late 1800s held this position. B.W. Newton, this is Aids to Prophetic Inquiry. He discusses this. He has a few books where he argues that Babylon is going to be rebuilt. G.H. Pember, another early writer, and then he was followed by one of my favorite writers, G.H. Lang, also holds that view. Of course, in more modern times, we've got folks like Mark Hitchcock and Charles Dyer. Of course, everyone knows Joel Rosenberg in the book Epicenter takes that position. Another one of the early classic writers is J.A. Seiss, Joseph Augustus Seiss. So they were believing, or are believing, that the most literal reading of the prophecy is that this mystery is simply literal Babylon. And again, that's sort of my second position, but I also think that position has some serious exegetical problems. And again, I deal with that in the book. And so then finally we get to the position that I hold, and that is the idea that the city of Mecca and the kingdom of Saudi Arabia is the fulfillment of this prophecy. And so with that said, I'm going to go ahead and just show the trailer to my new book, and then we'll be right back. All right. Well, again, I hope that you enjoyed that trailer. It's pretty telling. I mean, it really reveals my position, but it sort of just gives just a hint, just a little taste, just to whet the appetite. Again, I've taken the time to very carefully, very painstakingly work through this information. I've tried to do so in a way that is very understandable, that's simple to read, that, you don't have to be a scholar. This is just written for, your common student of the Scriptures to work through all of these difficulties. As I said, this is not just an oddball, strange topic. This is a subject which has, indeed, very real pastoral implications for us here on the earth today, and it will increasingly have profound implications for the church the closer that we approach the return of Jesus. So with that said, friends, again, if you want to get this from my website, Mystery Babylon, just go to my website at joelstrumpet.com, click on the store. I've also got the Babylon Bundle, where you get a few extra products at a discounted rate. So that is all the time that we have for this week. As always, I thank you so much for being with us. I look forward to seeing you next week. I'm Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground.